Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to PsychoBible. Okay, let's keep talking about controversial subjects. This time, the war between the sexes, which has actually morphed into the war on the very concept of sex, on gender itself, which I got into more in my one video on gender and sexuality through a theology of the body lens, so I'll try not to repeat too many things here. Now, things have really been ramping up over the past several years. There's Me Too, Time's Up, a plethora of women's studies and grievance studies, complaints about the patriarchy or calls to smash it, rhetoric from Trump, about Trump, the Women's March, heated battles over abortion, and there's a growing backlash against feminism. The men's rights movement, the red-pilled community, MGTOW, incels, and there's even a resurgence of traditionalism. But this is why the gender war deserves its own video. I believe the gender war is the center of the culture war. Even with the riots and the calls for a new Marxist revolution, is rooted in this gender war. I'll get to that near the end. So, are men to blame for everything? Is the patriarchy the ultimate villain of history? See, as we moved into agrarian societies and then on through our industrialization, humanity certainly did develop patriarchal systems. But as Jordan Peterson rightly points out, in defiance of the radical feminists, this patriarchy is not necessarily tyrannical. In general, both men and women just want to survive and build a civilization to protect against a brutal nature. And to survive, women relied on male strength and self-sacrifice, and men relied on female community building and child rearing. And so we worked together. There was agency and hypoagency. However, there were certainly abuses of the male leadership. And for centuries, women did not have the means to assert themselves in a more overt way. And so our gender roles, once needed for survival, became rigid and oppressive. This is a reality we can all admit. This conflict is universal. Even in Eastern cultures, the yin-yang represents masculine and feminine. We also see there how the corrupted versions lay themselves out in reality. The masculine, white and bold, is overtly dominant and aggressive. The feminine is hidden, subversive, manipulative. Throughout history, we have had the capacity to hurt each other in uniquely masculine and feminine ways. Instead of an intimate, loving union that creates life, our interactions are often missing at least one element. They may be intimate, but not loving. We might create life, but with no committed union. And we are reaping the consequences of this battle and of worldly solutions. First came feminism in the reaction to traditional male privileges. The second wave was like, we don't just want equal rights to do what is good and just, but now we want sexual liberation to do what is sinful without judgment. And of course, the pickup artist guys, sex and porn addicts, and F-boys, don't mind that version of feminism. It just feeds the male appetite for conquest without consequence. So it actually helped keep men from becoming men, stay boys. But then came third wave feminism, with its identity politics, intersectionality, and the reverse oppression hierarchy. And the Marxist agenda is far more overt. Men and all women who support the patriarchy are the enemy that must be smashed. And here now we're seeing a reaction from the men. The red pill, men's rights activists, MGTOW, the men going their own way, incels, involuntary celibates, right-wingers who are just doubling down on traditional stereotypes. And then sneaking up behind third-wave feminism is fourth-wave feminism with its postmodernism and agenda to actually abolish gender itself. Everything is a social construct to them, even sex. With this wave, people are beginning to realize the polarization is going so far that it's circling back around, because now we have men who claim to be women encroaching on women's only spaces, from athletics to women's shelters. The very movement formed to liberate women from oppressive men is now setting itself to consume itself, to to undo all the progress made. And as it's garnered the attention of the intellectuals, it's made for strange bedfellows. Conservatives now find themselves teaming up with so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists, and emboldened by University of Toronto psychology professor Jordan Peterson, a surge of people declared, "No, I'm not going to use your made-up pronouns, and I refuse to blame everything on the patriarchy." And now we're seeing a civil war within the secular culture as the modernists and postmodernists are fighting for territory in the public discourse and policy making. The materialist modernists are desperately trying to prove that sex is a biological reality and that a number of our gender differences are biologically based. Meanwhile, the radical feminists, or postmodern neo-Marxists, are adamant that sex itself is a social construct and all differences between the sexes is based on socialization and therefore must be eliminated.
There's been studies of human personality conducted all across the world, and psychologists have settled on a standard model that has 5 dimensions, 5 personality dimensions, and then have looked for differences between men and women across countries. And the crucial test was the Scandinavian countries, because the Scandinavians have done a lot to flatten out the sociological landscape for men and women.
Right.
And the consequence of that has actually been that the differences between men and women in Scandinavia have got larger, not only in terms of personality, but also in terms of interest. And interest is, men tend to be interested in things and women tend to be interested in people. And there's some decent evidence that thing interest is mediated by testosterone exposure in utero, which sounds pretty biological, all things considered. And you know, I've made the claim that in my classes that I don't buy the distinction between sex and gender, which was invented by John Money back in 1955, a single theorist, and whose ideas I think were quite badly discredited, especially by his involvement in the Johns Hopkins Gender Reassignment Clinic, which shut down just a few years ago.
Fortunately, in the midst of all this chaos, some people are beginning to wake up and realize we need to work towards solutions. We've had Jordan Peterson, and then out of his phenomenon has grown the intellectual dark web, and there's Rebel Wisdom, a UK group doing interviews with leading intellectuals about the culture war and our meaning crisis, as well as running groups for men's work. And they did several interviews that touched on the gender war that really stood out to me. They met with Cassie, Jaye, maker of the documentary The Red Pill, in which she shares her journey as a feminist who has a change of heart as she meets with the leading men's rights activists.
For me, really points to this weirdness that we live in, where the identity politics left in particular has kind of the reins of what's culturally acceptable, and a lot of pop culture power and a lot of media power. So they cannot, even though they can act as the oppressor, they can never admit that they're acting as the oppressor, because the entire worldview is based on there's only oppressor and oppressed. And
they are always on the side of the underdog.
Yeah, and so this makes it impossible for them to look inward at themselves and realize that they now have the power, or a lot of power, a lot more than perhaps they realize, or maybe not realize, but want to realize, and they're not using it responsibly. And this is the story of the last few years for me. I think you see it echoed everywhere, and you see it echoed in the gender discussion as well, I think.
So let's just hear a quick clip from that interview with Cassie.
I know that it helped a lot of people making this film, but I don't think we're anywhere near where we need to be. And I think the Red Pill movie was just a very early kind of icebreaker into these conversations. But I think we have a long way to go with gender relations, and hopefully eventually finding a healthier relationship between the genders.
They met with Warren Farrell, an early male feminist who then became the father of the men's movement.
And what's interesting about Warren Farrell is that he has been living this same dynamic since the 60s. He's a fascinating individual story because he was one of the very first male feminists. He was he was on the board of the National Organization for Women in America, and he then at the same time started leading men's groups. And in the men's groups, he was hearing stories that he realized were not part of the conversation. And when he started bringing the experience of the way that men have been hurt and the way that men feel that they have to perform certain gender roles and that they are seen as success He uses the words, for example, that yes, women are often objectified and seen as sex objects and judged by their looks. Men feel that they're often judged by success. He calls success objects. They're judged by their ability to provide. They're judged by their wealth. They're judged by their status. And there's this beautiful moment. I know that we both really enjoyed meeting him and spending time with him. There's this really beautiful moment towards the end of the interview where he said,
men have makeup too. Male makeup is, I am Dr. Warren Farrell, best-selling author of The Boy Crisis. What's my makeup? I'm doctor, best-selling, author. That's all makeup. It's me being afraid of saying, I'm also Warren Farrell, vulnerable human being in these 5 or 6 ways.
And they facilitated a conversation with the women who did the video from women to men.
And she then went through a process of sending this poem out to many other women, and they then came together to make the film. And a lot of them would then choose the bits of the poem that really spoke to them, the things that they'd done in the past. And a lot of them said they went through a real process through doing it as well.
I am a woman who has been hurt by men.
I'm a woman who has hurt men.
Who has hurt men.
I dream of a time when we all take responsibility for the part each of us plays in this battle.
When we can truly empower ourselves by owning our part of the mess.
And bring an end to the cycle of hurting and blaming.
And as I'm watching these conversations and watching the videos by other members of the intellectual dark web, I'm hopeful but also dismayed. Because once again, the world is trying to solve problems in its own materialist manner, or in some spiritual but not religious style.
And I would like to see marriage valued and looked at from a scientific standpoint of building a healthy society rather than from a religious origin. Because I'm not religious, and I wouldn't even call myself a traditionalist. But I do think marriage is a very important part of the backbone of our society for children.
What they fail to realize is how this crisis is rooted in the modern form of Gnosticism, the rupture of body and spirit. One of the architects of the Enlightenment, René Descartes, renewed this rupture when he said, "I think, therefore I am." It cemented this idea that humans are composed of distinctly dual qualities, physical and spiritual, or immaterial or mental. But a traditional, pre-modern, biblical understanding of humanity is holistic. A human is not just a body, as materialists argue, nor is a human just a spirit trapped in a body, as the spiritual but not religious types tend to argue, and even some Christians have fallen to this thinking. And so, modernist, materialist science is not going to solve this crisis. What we need is a system of belief and participation that unites the material and spiritual and transcends time and culture. That's true religion. But before the church can really contribute to solving this gender war, we need to resolve our own. In the church, we have had our own gender war for decades. The traditionalists claim a type of complementarianism, but this typical view of complementarianism is often shallow and based more on stereotypes, enforcing one-sided submission in marriage and in the church that can be downright oppressive or dismissive toward women. In reaction, there has been a call to egalitarianism in the church, claiming that we are all equal and must do away with any gender-based roles and expectations in marriage and in church leadership. This led to Christian feminism. In its darkest form, there's what we call a spirit reminiscent of Queen Jezebel, who ushered in rebellion through her influence over King Ahab. Everything goes back to Eden. The answer to understanding everything we're experiencing is right in Genesis. Adam relinquished his leadership, became passive. Eve fell for the serpent's lies, that God was not good, he would not provide, and so she became autonomous and she led her husband in eating the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so there was the fall from grace and a curse upon the designed order, the order that God had established. Man's labor in producing fruit from the earth would now be toil. Women's labor in producing human life, fruit in humanity, would now be painful. And her longing for relationship would be painful. As it says in Genesis 3:16, your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. He will dominate you. Now the meaning of the word for desire, teshuka, is disputed. It could mean simply longing for relationship, single-minded devotion, or even a desire to control, like a predator getting ready to pounce. But regardless, we must remember that this dynamic of the woman longing for her husband, either to connect or to manipulate, and husband ruling over her, is a consequence of sin. Him ruling over in an aggressive, in a selfish manner, is a consequence of sin. When we claim that this is the way it should be, we are giving a hearty endorsement of the fall. And we have seen this play out over the centuries. Misogyny in the church and world is real. We have to admit this. And it is perpetrated by both men and women. But there's a particular form of misogyny that most of us don't see. A hatred of the feminine. As feminism has progressed, women grew to reject their own uniquely feminine virtues in favor of masculine ones. Journalist and author Julie Roys shares this story of working with women who developed shame over their femininity.
And I remember one evening leading a small group of about 7 to 8 women, and we had talked about womanhood that evening. And my co-leader, Annette, said to the group, she said, what's something that you love about being a woman? Nothing. Complete silence. So we looked at each other and we're like, maybe we need to rephrase this question. So she asked, what's something you value in other women? And one woman said, strength. I admire women who are strong. Another said leadership. Yeah, I admire women who are strong leaders. Another said initiative. Another said intelligence. Yeah, now the group was really clicking. But what we noticed was that there wasn't one single mention of any sort of uniquely feminine virtues, like tenderness, compassion, nurture. And we brought this to the attention of the group. And one woman said, well, I don't like those things. I don't want to be any of those things, because when I'm one of those things, you know what happens? That's why men abuse us. That's the sort of thing that just invites it. Another woman said, yeah, absolutely. And now the group really started gelling. They're like starting to share their experiences. It was a really diverse group that we had. We had women that had chemical dependency issues, women who had self-esteem issues, women who dealt with depression, all sorts of issues. There was only one woman in this group that dealt with same-sex attraction. And if you looked at the exterior of these women, they all looked actually very feminine. Except for the one woman who dealt with same-sex attraction. She was more masculine in her appearance. But I remember as these women were sharing their stories and how they felt, her eyes got big and she leaned forward and she said, you're all like me. You're all like me. You see, she realized that even though it may manifest differently in all of us, we all had the same kind of brokenness in our souls. We all had been so deeply wounded in our feminine souls. And misogyny, when it's manifest in women, has a profound impact on their souls.
In her book, Redeeming the Feminine Soul, she describes her foray into Christian feminism and how discovering theology of the body was the key to healing her own wounds and resolving her struggle with femininity and masculinity. Egalitarianism fails to acknowledge the reality of our gender differences. let alone celebrate the different purposes and gifts inherent in the gender difference. Complementarianism acknowledges our gender differences, but our modernized version has canonized culture-bound rules and lost sight of the deeper meaning of gender. The reality is, the reason God made gender is to be symbolic. Sex roles are not ultimately important. The symbols are. The roles are good and right only insofar as they preserve the integrity of the symbols. Our bodies are physical symbols of the transcendent masculine and feminine, God's way of relating within himself and to us. Gender is not a human construct. They are representations of God. They are divine constructs. Male represents God's strength and initiative. Female, his openness and nurture. There's a spiritual dimension of misogyny because we are actually hating something about God himself. And our first exposure to these representations is through our parents, then on to our siblings, peers, and other role models. Both boys and girls need salient models of the masculine and feminine. We need mothers who are both attentive and nurturing. We need fathers who are both challenging and encouraging. If the models we have fail to symbolize God's masculinity and femininity as well as the union between the two, both boys and girls can end up internalizing misandry or misogyny. Girls can come to hate what is uniquely feminine about them. And boys will as well, that we have within ourselves, we participate in both the masculine and feminine. And so we can come to reject masculine or feminine traits within ourselves and in others. So how does theology of the body help with the battle between the sexes? There are several points to consider. First, men. Male headship is not part of the fall, but selfish domination is. God did establish a patriarchal hierarchy, which means sacred order. Hierarchy is sacred order. But it's one that is meant to serve to bring order that blesses others. Go back to my video on gender and sexuality, what the male means. We must take up our leadership role in serving and take the lead in honoring women and protecting them and their hearts from the serpent's continual attacks. As part of the curse, God predicted that there would be enmity between Satan and woman. Satan hates her capacity to bring life. He has had it out for her because it would be through one woman's union with the divine that the Redeemer would come. And his attacks have not let up because woman still is a representation of the church, of God's plan for intimate union with all humanity. When it comes to the church, we need to move beyond cultural and religious stereotypes and call for the mutual participation and appreciation of both sexes in the family and church. Biblical masculinity and femininity do not mean female oppression, nor denial of women's spiritual gifts. We need a reunion with the symbolic. The church must mirror God's unity in diversity, the union of heaven, which is the masculine, and earth, the feminine. Therefore, the contributions of both sexes are needed. Our gifts are to work in concert, not competition. And this oneness glorifies God because it most images him in his triune nature. However, this does not mean that all roles are up for grabs. A priest or a lead pastor is meant to be a type of spiritual father. Men alone can be fathers, and therefore spiritual fathers who administer the sacraments bear the responsibility for direction of a church family, just as Jesus is the head. To place a woman in the role of spiritual father is symbolic confusion. It undermines the integrity of the symbol. However, the church needs a place for spiritual mothers. The leadership should seek out wise spiritual mothers for counsel. I'm reminded of when my church decided to close, and the way the all-male board went about their decision and executed it was just so insensitive. They later regretted it, thank God. But at the time, I told my wife, I wish there was a female voice in that board that could have pointed out, hey, the way we're going about things is not going to go over well. People are going to need to be able to process this and voice their concerns and grieve and mourn. We can't rush this process and be so abrupt and direct about it. And in general, the gifts of preaching and teaching should not be limited to the senior pastors alone. Rather, a pastor's highest call is to develop the giftings in all of his members, male and female, cherishing them all. When it comes to the gender war in the greater society, Theology of the Body shows us that there should be no war at all. The goal is not for one side to dominate the other, and it's not for women to become more like men. Like what Gloria Steinem famously said, we are becoming the men we wanted to marry. The goal is not for men to become effeminate and passive, shutting up and letting women lead for once. Nor is it for men to go their own way, abandoning the call for marriage and family out of resentment and a narcissistic protection. No. Instead, like a good marriage, we need masculine men and feminine women to unite in complementarity. And in so doing, we interpenetrate and balance each other out. In unity, we can appreciate how women can also take initiative and men can be responsive. Because a healthy person has a degree of both masculinity and femininity within. It's just a matter of proportions, and there's a unique way in which men have feminine traits or virtues, and a unique way in which women have masculine virtues. It doesn't look exactly the same in both sexes. Now this brings us to my thesis, that the gender war is truly the center of the culture war in general. We must admit that traditional Western culture, since the Enlightenment, has overemphasized the masculine virtues. The masculine virtues are the ones of strength, or the hard virtues, whereas the feminine are of softness. The strong or the hard virtues start with an emphasis on truth, which then leads to justice, holiness, righteousness, responsibility, establishing standards. The soft virtues start with an emphasis on love, then mercy, compassion, kindness, forgiveness, making exceptions. This all goes back to Genesis as well. For when God created Eve and presented her to Adam in the first marriage, Adam declared with joy, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman," and the word he uses there is Isha, which means soft. For she was taken out of man. Ish, which means strength. The political and cultural polarities of left and right are representative of these virtues of God's masculinity and femininity. These differences are even reflected in the brain differences between men and women. Men think much more compartmentally and typically more left-brained, which is optimized for order and logical reasoning. Women, it's not so much that they're more right-brained and just emotional. They actually have more neural connections in their corpus callosum, the membrane that connects the two hemispheres, which gives them a greater access to the right brain, allowing for more emotional and intuitive thinking. This reminds me of what we say in dialectical behavioral therapy, that the wise mind is the intersection between the rational mind and the emotional mind. See, facts may not care about your feelings, but the fact is feelings are important for the full picture. In traditional cultures, there's a greater appreciation for both ways of knowing. There's an emphasis on holism. But in the modernist West, we've valued stoicism and rationalism, science, which ends up favoring a male perspective over a female perspective, unless a female then adapts to think and act more like men. But what we should have been doing was foster an integration of both ways of knowing. Now, with the rise in multiculturalism, we are now facing a revolution in ways of thinking and values. Instead of proper integration, the cultural Marxists are attempting a complete reversal of the hierarchy. This relates to parenting as well. There are masculine and feminine ways of parenting, both of which reflect the ways God cares for us. The mother soothes and nurtures, protecting children from the dangers of the world and distributing resources so no one in the family is in need. The father stimulates and challenges, preparing his children for harsh realities, not by sheltering them, but by modeling and teaching them the resilience they need to survive and provide for their own families. The association someone has with these models have a direct impact on their view of government. Is it any wonder then why when we've had generations of absent, tyrannical, or weak fathers that we have an outcry for a nanny state to provide for us? The desire for Marxism is the desire for the state to be an ever-nurturing mother, and in some ways, even a tyrannical father. It's like an overcompensating for the absent discipline of their own fathers. And finally, theology of the body is the key to the meaning crisis resulting from the rupture of the physical and spiritual. We are meant to fully be men and fully be women, and to fulfill our gendered callings. But these must be felt, they must be embodied.
I think it's worth also saying that our interest in these subjects probably comes from our own histories in terms of a lot of the kind of the inner work that we've done around masculinity. We both teach men's work, and ultimately these questions can only be resolved really in an embodied way. It cannot just become a conversation about masculinity and femininity, because then you get into this kind of swampy relativistic soup of, well, what do you mean by masculine? What do you mean by feminine? Surely we're just humans. And then it all starts to kind of become very relativistic very quickly. Whereas I know that my experience of doing work where I really connect with myself in my masculine, that there's a real embodied presence that I can bring to these questions, and then a lot of these kind of gender dynamics resolve themselves very, very quickly.
John Paul II resolved the Cartesian dualism, objectivity versus subjectivity, by his approach called Personalism. If we go deep enough into our experiences, we will gain subjective evidence of objective reality. Masculinity and femininity, male and female, are objective realities. They are not just social constructs. They really do exist. But they cannot just be taught abstractly to be believed. They must be felt. They must be experienced. And we do that in community, with God and with our fellow humans. So our wounds heal, our gender wounds heal, and we gain a sense of belonging and purpose. And that is what will heal this meaning crisis we are in. Okay, I know this was a big one, but it was important, and I had to do it in one video. So I hope you appreciate it. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. I'll see you next time.